Welcome everyone to the latest installment of CADCA's Research into Action webinar series. I'm Nicole Elguero, an analyst on CADCA's Evaluation and Research team. The purpose of this webinar series is to introduce coalition members and substance misuse preventionists to current and relevant research being conducted in the substance use and community coalition fields. In today's webinar, we're delighted to have Dr. Parissa Ballard join us for a presentation on engaging youth as leaders and partners can improve substance use prevention, a call to action to support youth engagement, practice, and research, published in Substance Abuse Treatment, Prevention, and Policy in 2023. Parissa J. Ballard, MA, PhD, is an associate professor of family and community medicine in the Wake Forest School of Medicine. Her research focuses on understanding how young people engage with their communities, increasing equitable and meaningful opportunities for youth voice in communities, and understanding how youth engagement can improve community efforts and promote healthy youth development. In one current project funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, she applies ideas from developmental psychology to increase opportunities for youth voice in substance misuse prevention efforts. In another current project funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, she's co-leading a randomized controlled trial study to understand the effects of a school-based action civics intervention. Outside of work, Parissa spends time exploring mountains, creeks, and playgrounds around North Carolina with her husband and 4 young children. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Ballard.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole, for the introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm so happy to be here, and it's such a thrill when people find an academic paper you wrote and think it might be useful for a broad audience. So I'm so thankful for CADCA for reaching out about this paper and excited to talk with you all today. So there's the paper, Engaging Youth as Leaders and Partners Can Improve Substance Use Prevention, a call to action. And this work is alongside some wonderful colleagues, and I'll be talking about some of their work today as I go. I'm hopeful that by the end of this session today, you can name some of the benefits and challenges of engaging youth as leaders and partners to improve substance use prevention. I'm going to talk about what I see as 3 core competencies that are really needed by people to support meaningful youth engagement work. And I'm hopeful that you can identify one next step for your own coalition or organization that you work with that you can take to increase youth voice in your work. So maybe it's a new skill to develop, a next conversation to have, or a relationship to build. So to start out just with some definitions of what do I even mean by youth engagement, right? I'm a developmental psychologist, so this question of who are youth is always a huge one. When I'm talking about youth today, I'm really talking about youth anywhere between the ages of 11 and 25. So that's a very broad range. 11-year-olds are quite different than people in their 20s. And it becomes very important in your work partnering with youth to really think exactly what age and developmental stage of the young people is who you are partnering with. But today I'm just talking really broadly across the spectrum of youth. I define youth engagement as an approach to prevention research and practice, where prevention researchers and members of the workforce effectively engage youth as leaders and partners in planning, tailoring, implementing, and/or evaluating prevention programming. So I'm really not talking about delivering curricula to youth or delivering a program to young people, but some programs do exist, certainly, and I've put a couple of graphics down below to call out some good kind of curricula and programming. But I am more talking about an approach, so it's kind of a point of view that coalitions and organizations can have about really partnering with and sharing power with young people as an approach and a strategy across your work to really improve the prevention work that you do. And I do love talking to CADCA audiences because I think there's such an ethos of partnering with youth and involving young people in your work already in coalitions. So that's great. So I would love, before I go much further, if you would put in the chat really quickly where you think you are in your own coalition work with youth engagement. So maybe you can just very briefly put like, oh, we absolutely partner with youth, or a little bit, we're working on it, we're struggling, or just beginning to think about it. If you could just pop that into the chat, it would help me know kind of who's in the room here and help me tailor what I'm going to talk about. And I don't see things popping up in the chat yet. Let me see if I can see the chat. Nicole, I might ask you to read. Are you seeing things in the chat?
So we have someone who's starting to develop this in their area specifically for prevention.
Okay.
Many people are saying just getting started,
Okay.
just at the beginning,
Okay.
struggle.
Struggle. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's challenging. Wonderful. Well, that's really helpful. Then I do have some content for kind of coalitions and organizations just getting started. So thank you. And all are welcome here, whether you're just getting started, struggling, whether you've been doing this forever. Hopefully we'll find something important here. So some of this work I'm presenting today really began out of some formative research that I did in North Carolina that was funded by the Department of Health and Human Services. And in North Carolina, they've really put some emphasis on trying to understand what the prevention for workforce is doing in terms of partnering with youth and what they need. So we did 21 interviews with members of the prevention workforce here in North Carolina, and we found a bunch of interesting things, including, I think, this quote that sums it up so nicely. One person said, I very much think the most effective projects we've ever done have been those community involvement, service learning, youth-led initiatives, but they're hard to do. And that sums up what a lot of people I work with say, like, this is so worth it. When we get young people really effectively and meaningfully contributing, our work becomes much better, but it's so hard to do. It's hard to recruit youth. It's hard to retain, youth in our projects and develop a sustainable model that's meaningful for young people. So we, kind of out of those interviews and hearing some of the training needs in North Carolina, we developed this guide, Engaging Youth to Improve Substance Misuse Prevention, an information guide. I have a QR code here, so I'll leave that up for a second. Hopefully that takes you to the link. It's free and, free for everybody to use. And it has some of the information I'm going to talk about today. So you can learn more in this guide. But to start, today I think I want to start by talking about what are the benefits of youth engagement, defined as partnering in a meaningful way with young people. And one is, I think, when we meaningfully partner with young people in our prevention work, it increases the relevance of the prevention work we do. So if we can get youth voice in helping choose prevention programming, advocating for policy, or changing our coalition organizational practices, this can really help just increase how relevant our prevention programming is to young people, because it's hard to implement really relevant prevention with young people. If we do it really well, it can increase the reach, the uptake, the quality, and really importantly, the responsiveness. So how our prevention is responding to the current and changing needs of the young people we're trying to reach. If we have young people partnering with us to really think about what's going on the ground with young people, who are a very diverse group, then it can increase how responsive we can really be in our prevention work. Youth culture is changing, right? So youth, they're not one group, and youth culture is changing over time. Prevention strategies and programs developed 20 years ago that might be evidence-based and really high quality might not actually be responsive to current youth culture as the landscape changes. One thing I'll point out is we all probably know a lot about the mental health needs of young people today are really serious and have changed a lot. And we want our ongoing prevention to really respond to the changing culture and needs of young people. Ideally, our partnering in a meaningful way with young people provides opportunities for themselves to develop skills, to gain support, to gain social connectedness with adults and with peers, and really have a sense of making a meaningful contribution in the prevention work that they do alongside adults in a coalition or organization. We're also ideally building youth capacity and building that prevention workforce pipeline, kind of getting people excited about prevention science and the work of prevention to maybe build the pipeline for the future. So these are some of the many benefits that can occur when we can partner in a meaningful way with young people in our work. So this is kind of my view of the world of youth engagement, is that you can kind of think about 4 different models for engaging youth in your prevention work. And I will talk through kind of how I think about these 4 different models and what they might look like. And one way to think about kind of levels of youth engagement as you think about partnering with youth in your coalition work is by kind of thinking about a ladder. So if you're a coalition or organization or a research team or whoever you may be, if you're just getting started with youth engagement, which it sounds like a lot of you are, or if you have a low level of capacity, so that could mean funding or person time, or if you have a low need, like maybe you're starting a project where you're just kind of putting your foot in the water and want some youth input, but you're not ready to start a 10-year initiative, you might want to start kind of low on this ladder as I have it here with like a youth consultant model. Working up the ladder, you really increase the level of youth leadership and really increase the kind of capacity you need to do it well, because then you're going to need to really have a lot of training for your staff as well as the young people you work with as you kind of go up the ladder to the more youth-led model. So I will talk through these 4 models and what they might look like in prevention, but I do want to make one important point here. And that is, I don't think the goal needs to be to climb up to the top of the ladder or to start really high on this ladder. I think a ladder graphic kind of implies that you want to climb it. But to me, it is not important that every coalition is doing completely youth-led work, but rather that you think about your current needs and capacity and what makes sense for you at a given point in time. And of course, that will change over time. So starting at the kind of at the bottom of the ladder with what I call youth consultant models. So I would say this is a situation where adults, maybe adults in your coalition or your organization, really are deciding on prevention efforts, but are kind of calling on youth to advise on specific aspects of your programs or your initiatives. And this model is especially useful if you're just starting out because it does require a lower level of organizational capacity. But still requires a lot of planning and thoughtfulness, thinking about how to compensate youth consultants for their expertise. And one thing to be really wary of is not tokenizing youth. So not kind of saying, okay, well, we have this one youth consultant and they think our program is great, so this program is youth approved, right? Like not putting a consultant in a position to speak for all youth and then calling it a day. So that's something to be wary of if you're using kind of a youth consultant model. Moving up the ladder a little bit, let's see, there we go, youth board models. So this is a kind of model I think about where adults are primarily deciding on prevention efforts, but youth are really advising on various issues in an ongoing way. So this might be really nice if you're starting out or if you've been kind of like had youth involved in different projects, but you want something more sustainable. A youth board or youth council might be a nice approach to get ongoing youth input. And the model can change a lot, but the idea here is sustainability, building a model where maybe you have a couple middle schoolers, a couple high schoolers, and a couple later high schoolers. And so as youth age through their schooling, they are training the younger ones, and you're kind of building a more sustainable infrastructure for youth input in your work. This typically requires a little higher level of training for young people, like they might need training in how to attend and run meetings, or training in prevention itself and in substance use. So as you're going up this ladder, again, needing a little more youth training and more training for your coalition staff in how to meaningfully partner with youth, given more youth input. Moving up slightly more, I think about youth partner models as a really broad kind of model where youth and adults are partnering in prevention efforts, and young people can serve in a lot of different roles. So this might be young people are serving as researchers or evaluators with your coalition, advocates, or they might be staff, or they might be program implementers if that's kind of allowable with the program you're implementing. With youth partner models, you might hire younger people on your team. If you're able to do that, that might be a way that young people can really have some leadership because they're hired staff within your coalition. I think the nature of the partner role really depends, again, on those needs of your coalition or organization at the time. Young people in these roles really do need quite a bit of training to be able to do their role well. And here, I think the adults often need a lot of training as well to really learn some of the practices of truly partnering with young people that involve difficult things like sharing power and creating really youth-friendly practices, which we'll talk about a bit. So youth-led models here at the top are really when you have youth-initiated and youth-led programming, and adults are kind of providing support and infrastructure and maybe are invited to share in decision-making. This is really hard work to do. I think this model is especially useful for coalitions, organizations who have long-standing partnerships with young people already in place. I know because I've met some CADCA coalition folks at different conferences. Many have a sort of partner coalition that are their youth coalition. Other coalitions might have youth members of their coalition, but that lead their own initiatives. So this can look a lot of different ways in practice. But this really is where young people with the appropriate training and experience are really leading things and kind of asking the adult coalition partners for their support. In this QR code takes you to the information guide that I have already had a QR code to, but we have a tool in there that this is a decision tree tool where we kind of walk you through thinking about your organizational and your youth capacity, your goals, and helping you think through what might be a good model for your organization, as well as then giving a lot of examples of what these different models can actually look like in prevention. So I'm not going to go through this right now, but I wanted to flash up that in that guide, we have some tools that are meant to be helpful for thinking through, especially developing a new youth engagement model. So one of the reasons I really emphasize not starting at the top of the ladder or pressuring yourself to get to the top of the ladder is that youth engagement involves real challenges. And it's important to be realistic about those challenges at the beginning and as you go with your partnering with young people in this work. One that comes up again and again and again is just how hard it is to share power. I think that's hard in any relationship, marriages, with friends, anything, sharing power, shared decision making is really hard. But it really is, there's an added layer of complexity when we adults are trying to unlearn some of what we've learned in order to truly share power with young people. That means really facing some of your own biases in what it looks like to share power and give up some of the power that I think we as adults are used to having. But also really looking at organizationally, like what are the constraints, right? So if we're truly asking for youth input and partnership, are there constraints on what we can do with the advice that you give? So there's all kinds of complexities around power sharing. Could be a whole webinar. Another example of a challenge that comes up a lot is youth are in a transient stage of life, especially if they're transitioning from middle to high school or high school and beyond. Young people move around a lot. They're just in transition, so it can be really hard to retain young people over the course of a project. Logistical barriers are real. A huge one is transportation, time, because young people are so busy, and funding. This one's probably the number one thing that comes up in my partnerships with different prevention organizations and coalitions. Like, how do I fund this work? So if we truly believe that youth are experts and we're partnering with them and we want to compensate them for their time, we have to appropriately fund them. And it's really hard to work within the funding constraints in the prevention landscape. Another one that comes up a lot is finding the right youth. So a lot of times prevention coalitions and organizations might find some young people who are involved in a million things. And that's both challenging because they are very busy, but also challenging because then you have the same handful of young people involved in lots of things. And if we want partnering with youth to be an opportunity, you might want to make it more available to people who aren't involved in every activity. So finding the right youth, and also the right youth means for your needs at that time, for the communities you're working in, for who you're trying to represent and reach, right? So that can be a big challenge. And that we've touched on sustaining commitment and motivation over time. Sometimes you might recruit a great youth board and then their commitments change and they have to drop off, or they change and transition to another life stage and you have to retrain people. And it can be very frustrating given the time commitment that it takes to really develop these relationships with young people. Funding constraints we touched on. And then training, this one comes up a lot. Is both wanting training for organizational or coalition kind of staff, the adults who really could use training and how to partner with young people, and for youth themselves who may be new to coalition work, prevention work, kind of could use training in both the substantive areas, but also in like leadership development and skills. So there's kind of a need for more training. So these are a lot of the challenges. They are sticky. I can't say I have answers for them, but they are, I think, addressable. But what my colleagues and I did recently was write this paper, the one that I was invited to talk about today, where we really say, okay, what really are the competencies that we think is needed, especially among adult coalition and organizational members, in order to meaningfully partner with young people? So we came up with 3. There's a lot of words here because I pasted these from my paper. The first competency we think people really need is an understanding of adolescent development across key domains. So adolescents are developing physically, emotionally, socially, cognitively, spiritually, in terms of their identity. So I think adults trying to partner with youth, having a real understanding of what's going on with adolescent development is critical, as well as understanding the core elements of youth-adult partnerships. And so there's been quite a bit written about this. There are some trainings on this, but key elements of youth-adult partnerships being authentic decision-making, natural mentors, reciprocity in sharing youth adult skills, and community connectedness. And I'll go through each of these 3 competencies with some specific tips in a moment. The second competency that I think is really needed and meaningfully partnering with young people in this work is applying this understanding, right? So understanding adolescent development and youth adult partnerships is really critical, but then we have to apply it to how we design our partnered meetings, our youth adult meetings, how we design our materials, and how we design the programs that are meant to serve young people. So both knowledge of adolescent development and youth adult partnerships, and then how to actually apply that knowledge in our work. And finally, one of the competencies is, we think, in the area of relational practices. So some of these key relational practices that support youth adult partnerships are supporting youth to make decisions, engaging in communication that is truly open and two-way, working jointly together towards common goals, and again, that sharing power. And these relational practices between adults and youth can really enable authentic collaboration between youth and adults. So this is kind of what we argue in the paper. And the point of the paper, there's no findings in it. So in that way, it's not a classic kind of research paper that I'm used to writing. But we're really trying to make an argument that we need more funding and training, both for research on youth engagement in substance use prevention and also in practice. Because my practice partners that I hear from really want to do this. They want to partner with youth more and amplify the voices of youth in their work, and feel that they lack the training and time and funding necessary to do it. So let me try to get a little bit more practical. I'm going to go through each of those 3 competencies and just offer resources. I'm just offering infographics, and when we share the slides afterwards, hopefully you can spend some more time with them and that they will be helpful resources. Again, adolescent development and youth adult partnerships could be entire webinars or semester-long classes. So here I'm just sharing one resource I really like, and this is out of UCLA, the Center on the Developing Adolescent, and they have excellent resource and materials on their website if you just Google UCLA, Center for Developing Adolescent. But one of these I really like is they kind of see 6 key developmental needs of adolescents. And I really like this approach to thinking about adolescents needing these key things. So the first is safe and satisfying ways to explore the world and take healthy risks. So healthy risk-taking, a key need of adolescents, real-world scenarios to build their decision-making and their emotion regulation skills. The third, having an avenue to develop a sense of meaning and purpose by contributing to peers, families, and communities. Having positive ways to earn respect and social status, having experiences that help them define their values and goals, and having warmth and support from parents and other caring adults. So these are almost all in the domain of kind of social emotional development for adolescents, but these key developmental needs can be met in a lot of ways by adult coalition members or adults who are trying to engage young people in the meaningful work that you're doing. So engaging young people if they have especially passions around prevention, and allowing them, sharing power with them in your coalition work can allow them to develop a sense of meaning and purpose through contribution, can allow them to develop these relationships that are warm and supportive with adults. So something I really like about understanding some of the key developmental needs of adolescents allows us as adults to tailor our practice with young people to their developmental needs. So that's only scratching the surface of adolescent development, but here's one resource that I really like. Okay, the second key competency we think is applying this knowledge to work engaging youth. And so here's where hopefully this gets kind of practical. This is a handout. I know that the print is kind of small, so I'm just going to elevate a couple of these. But this resource comes from my colleague who's a co-author on the paper, Dr. Heather Kennedy. And she calls these 7 adultist practices that are missed opportunities for learning and skill development and disrupt trust between adults and young people. So these are framed in a negative way. These are adultist practices that are very common in settings where young people and adults are interacting. So I'm just going to read the 7 practices. They are policing, lecturing, disengaging, having an obvious separation of youth and adults, giving incomplete instruction in our practices with young people, excluding youth, and making negative comments. So this is where I invite you all to, and myself, to kind of look in the mirror and think, do I, employ any of these practices in my work with youth? And the answer, I think, for all of us is probably yes. My oldest child is 10 and a half, and he has let me know that I can tend to lecture, to fall into the pattern where instead of asking open-ended questions and having a conversation when I'm not happy with something he's done, I can fall into this pattern of lecturing, which I think is true. So I notice this pattern in myself, no matter how much I think about my own practice with the young people in my life. So I think some of these are easier to address, obvious separation of youth and adults, for example. So maybe notice next time you're in a coalition meeting or any meeting where there's young people involved, what is the physical setup? Are there youth on one side of the room and adults on the other side of the room? When there's a break, do adults go talk to each other and youth go talk to each other? Or is there really intentional physical setup? Maybe it's a circle. Maybe adults intentionally sit next to youth and engage them in conversation. Maybe it's just the intentionality of the physical space and how we come into a room and notice that there are younger people and try to make them comfortable by interacting together. So that one sounds easy. I mean, that's a relatively easier thing to see and to fix. So that's why I'm elevating that one. But I just invite you to think about these 7 adultist practices, reflect on where you might practice some of them, or where you see them in your own settings with youth, and think about one step towards changing that. Okay, and the third competency we talked about is key relational practices that you can employ as adults wanting to meaningfully partner with youth in your work. Again, this is kind of a busy handout. This is also from Dr. Heather Kennedy, and this is from a published paper. You could find more about it. But these then, framed more positively, are working with you some of the practices that really can support genuine youth-adult collaboration. So I'll read the blue headlines first. So facilitating with intention, letting youth lead, acknowledging power, working together, learning to let go, engaging in dialogue, and celebrating accomplishments. And I think since we do have time, I'll talk about maybe a couple of these practices that can support genuine youth-adult collaboration. Let me see which one. I think acknowledging power is one that I think can be especially powerful. So I think we as adults aren't completely trained or attuned to apologizing to young people when we make mistakes, but that can be a very powerful practice. Just, we're not always perfect. And so reflecting on that and showing up and saying, hey, in our last meeting, I shut down a conversation about a topic because it made me uncomfortable. I'm sorry. That was a mistake. I wish I would have left more space to explore that with you. Do you want to explore that now? So that's an example that I've seen where adults who truly are invested in meaningfully partnering with young people are able to reflect on their own practice and just acknowledge when they made a mistake and try to fix it. And that is a surprisingly powerful for young people to see adults taking responsibility. It's good modeling about taking responsibility, but also it just doesn't happen that much in the society that we have. It's frankly not that common for example, teachers. So school is the most common setting where young people are with adults, and it's not that common for teachers to say, I made a mistake, acknowledge that, I want to fix it. So it's a very powerful practice if we can do that in our coalition partnerships with young people. Let's see, celebrating accomplishments is another one I think is really especially powerful with young people. So coalition work is kind of a slog in a lot of ways. It's long. It's, building community coalitions, long, change is slow to come. Partnerships and relationships evolve over time. And I think in a lot of ways, we adults can both be burnt out by that, but also maybe understand that and can contextualize a little bit how slow going and bumpy kind of coalition building can truly be. So young people don't have all that life experience necessarily to know that. So I think some really powerful youth-friendly, youth-centered practice is celebrating very small accomplishments along the way. So if you're planning a big event, definitely you want to celebrate once that big event is over and point out how successful it was. But even along the way, just celebrating like I got a vendor to agree to come to this event, or all of these many steps along the way, acknowledging them and celebrating them can be so powerful to young people. Honoring birthdays and other special occasions. So that I've seen that just be a really powerful practice where young people feel really seen when the adults that they're partnering with kind of know what's going on in their lives and take a moment to call it out and celebrate a birthday, graduation, a big sports event or something. Even better is if we can show up and support them. I will say that I struggle here, as I'm sure many people on this call, because I have a family with my own young kids, and I find my community partnered work often happens best on nights and weekends. So showing up for young people is something I really value, and also something I find really hard to enact just in my own life, given my work and my family commitments. But within the context of like youth adult meetings, if you can take a moment to celebrate, recognize their accomplishments and behavior, that can be very powerful. I think I'll go on there. Let's see. Yeah, I think I'll go on to the last couple slides and then invite some discussion, and I'm happy to come back to any of these and talk specifically about some of these, maybe examples that have come up in your practice, or I can share further examples. I do want to share a bunch of these resources. So there are a lot of great resources out there for different guides about youth engagement. SAMHSA has a youth engagement guide that I have linked to. I have linked to UCLA so the UCLA Center on the Developing Adolescent has a lot of great resources about adolescent development. They also have some great, a guide about youth engagement in research, including one that was co-developed by young people meant for practitioners. And it's fabulous. So I've linked to it here. I know you can't get to the links from this, but when we share slides afterwards, hopefully this will be helpful. The YPAR Hub out of Berkeley. YPAR stands for Youth Participatory Action Research. It's a whole kind of movement within the research world about really partnering with youth to do research. They have a lot of helpful curriculum guides and resources at the YPAR Hub. There's a hub for justice-centered youth engagement and the Uprise movement. That's out of Colorado. My colleague Heather Kennedy leads that, and she's got a bunch of great resources. CADCA has a guide to rural youth engagement that we've linked to here. And finally, I do want to plug my colleague Heather Kennedy and I are giving a 2-part youth engagement workshop style series, May 8th and 15th. So that's coming up for people here who want a little more. It's a little more hands-on. So we'll have a lot of discussion and some reflection about youth engagement as it applies to your work. That's hosted by the PTTC, the Prevention Technologies Transfer Center. So I've linked to that as well, and would love to have people join if more training on this would be helpful. So I'm leaving lots and lots of time for discussion, but I'm hoping that this session invites you to consider a few things. One is how could our prevention work benefit from the perspectives of youth? Another is where in our existing workflow can we include or amplify the voices of youth? Because I think we have to acknowledge that we're all part of systems. We're all part of complicated coalitions that maybe are part of organizations that exist in society. So I think we have to think also practically about like, what is my existing workflow and where are the small places that I might be able to include or amplify young people's voices? So it doesn't have to be starting an entire youth board tomorrow. That is probably not the right starting point, but just looking at, okay, what are we doing? Could we have a youth forum on that? Could we engage some youth input in different creative ways on some specific thing we're doing that could maybe grow over time into a more sustained youth engagement kind of approach? And finally, I hope that you will consider, and in fact, I would love for you to put in the chat right now, one step that you or your coalition might take to further your partnerships with youth. So I'm sure many of you are doing this. Maybe you have a youth coalition, maybe you're part of a youth coalition, or what is something you could do right now? Just one next thing. Again, this could be like, oh, we could get more training in adolescent development, or we could start talking to a youth club at our school, or just what is something you could do next to further your partnerships with youth? And I would love if people put those in the chat. I might even stop screen sharing and try to actually see the chat. And hopefully that can be a way to open up discussion. And I would just love to answer any questions or think with you about your practice partnering with young people. So I'm going to stop sharing. There's my email address. I'm also happy to follow up afterwards. And I want to acknowledge that this work is funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse through a 5-year project. And it really grew out of work that was funded by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. So thank you so much. I think, why don't I stop sharing? I'm going to go back to this for a second. So if people can put in the chat, one next step you're seeing, maybe something that grabbed you in this presentation that you could do to further your partnerships with youth. With that, I think I will stop sharing. Hopefully I can look at the chat. And Nicole, send it to you, I think.
Yeah, I also have some questions. So I'll start the Q&A session, but I'll have this slide up while we read a few responses in the chat.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a lot of getting more training and more interaction with youth.
Mhm. Open pizza parties to hear their conversations in a casual setting. I love that. I love that. Food. I don't even think I mentioned food, but I almost always make sure I mention the food. If you have food, young people are, gosh, they're so much more likely to attend. But I love that. That's to hear their conversations. So you're not going to them and saying, you know, what do you think about this? You're just inviting them for food and hearing them. I love that. People starting a youth council, changing the Native Generation Youth Council to a coalition. Now that's interesting. So that I'm curious to hear more about that. Conducting an inventory to identify levels of support needed for students. Oh, okay, that's cool. So starting with the getting youth perspective on what is needed.
Amanda
Amazing.
also mentioned highlighting birthdays when possible and just doing little things like that to build up a connection.
Yes, the connection is key. Anything you can do. I think the highlighting birthdays is a good example, but there's so many ways to just build that connection. It's so all about connections and relationships. Speak to upper management on the need to start collaborating. I love that from Jessica Valadez. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. Yeah, that's beautiful because we have to acknowledge, even if we're a true champion for youth voice, we are in these systems. And if you don't have support of upper management or whoever you need, then you might unintentionally set up a system where you start this great youth initiative, but ultimately that youth input can't go anywhere. And that really is a challenge that people face. So I love that. Collaborating with schools to find the relevant clubs that exist. So that's a great point because you don't always have to start something from scratch. You often can go to where youth already are and what they're already interested in. So I love that. Hosting a conference. Oh, but we've not had youth on the planning committee. So that's a good next step. Inviting youth to participate in early stages of a youth conference. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's a great next step. Formalizing training for our staff. Yes, absolutely. Sorry, Nicole, I got so involved in reading these. I don't know if you want to turn me to questions, I can.
No problem.
Okay, let me read a few more then. Will we get copies of the slides? Yes, so much to write down. Yes, absolutely. You will get copies of the slides. Do needs assessment and engage youth more. Okay, but there's one that I need to talk about here. Our grants won't allow us to pay for food. How do you do it? So I'm just going to give, this is very tricky. This is very tricky. So one place I've seen people have success is looking for private donors. So those could be people or those could be local, like publics, like local businesses often have pots of money for things like this. If you say we do this prevention work and we really want to provide food, especially if you advertise for them, that's a win for them. But even without that, some private businesses and individual donors are sometimes willing to give an unrestricted budget to things like food. So often I've seen people go that route in order to actually pay for the food that gets youth to come to some of the meetings. That's a great point. So I'm sharing these slides. I think we're adultists. Thanks for making me aware. Thanks for saying that. I think we all are, maybe some more than others, but absolutely our practices are not necessarily set up to truly partner with youth. So I think a great step is really reflecting on that. Okay. Love to get food donated and exchange dialogue. So somebody's talking about strengthening families where we made healthy meals. Yep. Connection and purpose. Okay, this is wonderful. I'm only like, there's 41 new messages that I haven't read yet. So Nicole, do you want me to turn it to you for some question and answer?
I have a few questions of my own, and then we'll move on to participant questions. So
Great.
I'll start, and please continue typing questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. It'll be easier to find than if you put in the chat box, so please use the Q&A feature. All right, so Dr. Ballard, you mentioned a broad age range for youth, about 11 to 25 years old. Do you have any age-specific strategies to engage youth in prevention?
Yes, I love this question because as a developmental psychologist, I could speak for a long time about different age specific or even more developmental stage specific strategies. So I tend to think about early adolescence, middle adolescence, and late adolescence. And early adolescence, if we think about those like 11 to 14-year-olds, so those are kind of middle schoolers, they tend to start being disinterested in school or anything that smells like school around that age. So they tend to be very social and also tend to be sensitive to things about respect and status. That kind of those developmental needs really come up in early adolescence. So I would say the more social you can make it, it needs to be fun. So it needs to be serious in the prevention work we do, but it has to be fun activities, again, food and just active activities. So the less lecturing, the better. And really, the less it looks like school, the better. And the more it involves choice and status. So young people, being afforded leadership opportunities and respect from adults actually is really meaningful, as well as respect from peers. So that's for the kind of early adolescents. Middle adolescents, now we're thinking like high schoolers, maybe 15 to 18-year-olds. I'm speaking in broad sweeps, but at that age, often young people have really specific passions about certain causes. So for kind of high school age, I might think about starting with where their passions are and how can kind of substance use prevention, how is it related to where they're already really passionate? So there's a lot of passion right now about environmental justice, a lot of passion about mental health. And so those are things that are intersecting with substance use and prevention, but I might come at it from that angle of what are their existing passions. Those middle adolescents, thinking high school age, are also, it's really nice to think about them as near peers, think about them in a leadership role, because now they've had some experience with adolescents and they can be near peer mentors for younger people. So really framing this around helping high schoolers think about prevention, targeting or aimed towards younger people can be really effective. And then when you're thinking about older adolescents, they're often transitioning into early adulthood. They look a little bit more like adults, and they might be a little less likely to challenge kind of adult ways of thinking. So there, I would say, really emphasizing their independence. They're taking on social responsibilities and role. They can probably contribute more. So emphasizing that, as well as really encouraging them to challenge some of the kind of standing adult type views, can be effective.
Yeah, thank you. And you discussed 3 foundational competencies for youth engagement training in your presentation. Could you tell me more about how coalitions can implement this in their work?
Yeah, so I think I would say a good next step would be maybe thinking about those like 7 adultist practices and some of the more youth-centered practices. So I would personally start there as somebody kind of elevated in the comments too, really thinking about what are my goals with partnering with youth, and what are my biases, and what are how are our practices currently set up in our coalition that's not that youth friendly. And just start with one practice. How can we change the physical setting of our meeting room? How can we change the schedule to be more youth friendly? How can maybe we adult staff have an open conversation about our potential biases towards youth, and then identify some ways to do that? None of this happens overnight. All of this is long work, but I would say a good next step is maybe doing that like self-reflection and organizational reflection. So get an ally in your coalition and say, let's think about this. If we really want to partner with youth, are we set up to do that really well? And looking at your own practices, I would suggest.
And where can interested coalition members find more information about your work related to youth engagement? And you mentioned you're working on a couple of research projects on this topic.
Yeah.
So how can participants best use the findings from your research on this topic?
Yeah, so in terms of my work, I think the Youth Engagement Guide is meant to be user-friendly, or at least to help start a conversation and a reflection about a youth engagement approach. So I would go there. I would want to specifically plug again that we're giving a little bit more in-depth workshop style training coming up through the PTTC. So I've linked to it, but I'll also just say, if you look up Southeast PTTC Youth Engagement, you should come up with these 2-part series. so you can definitely learn more if you want to do more practical about your own kind of coalition work and potential partnerships with youth. That could be really helpful. I've given some webinars through the PTTC that are recorded, and so there's a lot of that exists out there. In terms of my research work, so much of it is in research papers. So I would say I'd be happy to share. In fact, I'd love to follow up with you, Nicole, with I have a few more resources to share. I'd love to post alongside these slides. It might be helpful for folks.
Yeah, I can definitely include in the follow-up email all the resources you mentioned and the presentation and any others that you have for the audience.
Cool.
A lot of people are asking about, can you send that link again?
Okay.
Well, I'll definitely include in the follow-up email.
Great.
Okay, so now we'll move on to participant questions. So please continue sending any presentation related questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I found some in the chat, and I do have some in the Q&A box. Do you have any software that helps everyone stay connected, like an app you recommend?
So I'm guessing that means specifically with young people, like that. Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah, please.
So it has depended in several different projects. It has kind of depended. A lot of young people use Google Drive through school. So I use that in my partnered work with organizations. I find that pretty open access and easy. I have run out of storage, so that does become a problem, but I think the Google platform is pretty good for just sharing documents and stuff. WhatsApp has been a good hit with young people, but that was a couple of years ago. But that's how they preferred to talk. So I definitely always ask them, where are you? How can we best get to you? It's always text over email. I'm so on email, but that never works. So I suggest talking to your young people about a platform to keep people involved, if that's what you're asking.
Got it. What barriers are encountered in youth engagement, like permission slips, photo taking, parental and/or other chaperone rules? Also like background checks on adults working with them, etc.
All of those.
Experience, yeah.
Yeah, all of those. Yeah, so we've encountered all of those, and thanks for bringing it up, because actually that we do talk about that a little bit in the guide, but I didn't mention today, but there are real legal as well as kind of ethical questions around youth adult partnerships. So I would start with your organization and what processes do you already have in place, and make sure you're covering all that. If you're working with youth in schools, you have to get background checked to even partner with schools. You need parental permission to do anything formally through schools. So I think there are levels of existing legal and ethical kind of permissions, and that's really important. I personally also think that even if you don't, that it's best practice to have adults have background checks if they're going to be working in partnership with youth. There are some kind of unwritten best practices, like never having one adult with one young person, like that one-on-one. It may be best to have several youth if they're going to be with one adult at all times, or several adults and several youth together. So there's kind of that kind of best practice, but those aren't written legal things, but those are practices that I suggest. And parental permission is interesting. I think you do want to let parents know that what you're doing with young people. And there's a movement in North Carolina about parental permission is required to even give surveys to young people in schools now. People might be aware of that. So I would say you'd be in good stead to make sure you're letting parents know and getting their permission. At the same time, it's tricky because you don't want to undermine young people's autonomy. And if you're partnering within an organization that already works with schools, I don't think you need to send a piece of paper home every time you do any activity with young people. It's a little bit of a balance of definitely making sure you're protecting young people from real harms, but not undermining kind of young people's autonomy with the work you're doing together. But for sure, those barriers are real. There's legal and permission slips and a lot of paperwork bureaucratically to do.
Thank you. And I wanted to mention our first question asking about different softwares. We have a lot of people in the comments mentioning different softwares like GroupMe, Remind, Discord, Signal, and Basecamp for group projects.
Oh, what is that one? Signal, Basecamp? I don't know that one.
Signal and Basecamp for group
Basecamp?
projects.
Okay.
I haven't heard of those either.
Okay. That's great. Thank you.
Also.
keep sharing. I've used GroupMe. That has worked well. I've not heard of Signal and Basecamp. Great.
Just do a few more questions. What would you suggest as an elevator speech when recruiting youth? I've tried many different ways, and we even started doing drop-in events to engage first and then invite, but they've not been well attended.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is a great question, elevator speech. So short, kind of like a pitch to recruit. So I have to answer this in several ways. Let me try to be not long-winded. So if you're trying to recruit youth to attend an event, I would say this is where it's very helpful to have an ongoing way of getting youth input, because young people are probably best to say, oh, flyers don't work, or do a TikTok and share it with these people and they'll share it with everyone. So if you have like a group of young people who can give input on recruiting for a specific event, I think that can be really helpful. It's hard to give a specific elevator speech because it matters so much who the youth are that you're trying to recruit. So again, just being really responsive to the particular young people you're working with. But I hear you saying we're providing food, we're providing drop-in events, we're trying to make it casual. So you're trying some of these things and young people aren't attending. I guess in that specific scenario, one thing to look at is like what time of day. If you're doing something at night and sports and people are busy, could you partner with a school or even a sports organization and offer an event that's like as people are leaving soccer practice, or during lunch one day that you have food in the corner of the lunchroom or something. So I would look at the spaces where young people already are congregating to see if that works, and starting where young people are already interested in. So like looking at existing clubs or something, again, maybe not, I don't know what you're doing, but like maybe not leading with, this is a prevention event, but leading with like partnering with a mental wellness club or event or something, and kind of coming in that way.
Thank you.
Sorry, sorry,
Okay.
I didn't really answer the elevator pitch part. I would say key talking points for young people, depending on their age and who they are, but key talking points might be about how much you value their input. So depending on the thing you're doing, we really value, like, we need youth perspectives to make XYZ thing better. We would really value your time and input. We have funding or we have food, kind of emphasizing what they can get out of it, but also emphasizing what you need to get out of it. So putting their sort of empowerment front and center, like we really need you to make this thing better. I think that speaks to a lot of young people, and like, oh, I want to be a leader. I want to have my voice heard. I would like to contribute. And then finally, social connectedness. So if it's anything social or with peers, or they can bring friends, I would emphasize that in an elevator pitch, like come do this thing, bring your friends, or get a group of people, we'll provide food or something. So social connectedness, that your voice matters, and we'll provide food or money, I think are key things for an elevator speech.
Yeah, and here's one last question from participants. What are some ways to keep youth, excuse me, what are some ways to keep youth involved after leaving high school?
This is a hard one that I don't know that I have, or that my partner organizations have really solved, because I think the reality is people's lives do change after high school, depending where they go. Some get jobs and their life changes, some go on to further education. So maybe adjusting expectations a little and ask, what does your organization or your project really need from young people? Like, do you need to keep them involved after? And if it's really yes, then I guess go back to the ask, or try to gauge what level of commitment is reasonable. Maybe they'll be back in their hometown once a year and you can have one in-person meeting and one kind of virtual event. Maybe you send them things in the mail that like, again, this takes funding, but like, sending them stuff, like keeping that connection where you're continuing to provide stuff for them that they need, and checking in, like, what do you need? So this is a little bit of a different example, but I have some young people in my research group who have gone on past high school or past college or past grad school, and chosen to stay committed. And we have just restructured our meetings to say, instead of doing 80% of it on research, now we do 60% of our research meetings on professional development, because their needs have changed. They are in different phases of life. And so like seeing what you can provide for them and really trying to provide it keeps people coming back. But also, sadly, sometimes people don't keep coming back because they just move on, and maybe that's okay. Maybe it's looking at the structure of what you really need. Maybe you just need them to train a new group of young people, and that is a way to have a sustainable structure.
There are also a lot of great suggestions in the chat. Some people are mentioning college campus coalitions, mentorship or internship opportunities, and bringing alum back to do training with their after high school.
Oh, that's good. I love that. Yeah. So then they're in the real leadership role and they're training the next generation, but they're as leaders and internships. I love that too. I see that now. Yeah.
All right,
That's
there's
great.
so many great questions. I wish we could get to more, but I can share that with you after, and they have your contact information if they want to contact you after the webinar. Okay. So we want to remind you to please take a couple of minutes to complete an evaluation for this webinar. You can scan the QR code with your phone's camera to access the form. And I also just added the link in the chat. You can receive a letter of participation if you complete the webinar. You'll download it from the thank you page at the end of the survey, and you must download it immediately because you won't be able to access it once you close the screen. As I mentioned earlier, we will send a follow-up email to all attendees this week. It'll have the presentation recording, a copy of the slides, and the evaluation. We do have the next Research into Action already scheduled, so please mark your calendars for Tuesday, May 7th at 1 p.m. We'll feature a research article by Dr. David Jernigan. He'll discuss the impact of reducing selling hours for alcohol on violent crimes. And I will also include the registration link in the chat box. Also, the annual survey of coalitions is still open. You can email survey@cadco.org to receive your coalition's personalized survey link. If you complete the survey in April or May, your coalition will be entered into a drawing to win a $50 gift card or a 50% registration discount for our Mid-Year Training Institute in Chicago this July. All right, and thank you, Dr. Ballard, for your presentation on youth engagement and the work you're doing in the field. If anyone in our audience has evaluation-related questions, please reach out to CADGA's evaluation and research team at evaluation@cadga.org. And as always, thank you for your participation and support. We hope to hear from you in the evaluation, and we'll see you next